Hey everyone, how's it going? This is the Bald Metal Nerd coming at you with another video in this wonderful divorce series that I'm doing. Um, Essentially in this one, I'm going to be talking about when I reached my breaking point, right? Because in the last video in this series, I was talking about, kind of the 10 years of misery that I was in. Uh, which is eventually, of course, what just led me to have my breaking point, right? So, what allowed me to have my breaking point? Why, what were the circumstances around it and all that? So, again, 10 years of misery. So, kind of, I think what allowed the breaking point to happen in the first place were two things, right? Number one was my older daughter was out of the house, right? She had been out because I hit my breaking point October of 2022. So, my older daughter had been out of the house. She left in 2020 or 2021. I don't honestly remember the exact year she left. But when my older daughter left, that eased things in the house, right? And first, having her gone was a giant relief. However, my marriage was still terrible, was still in a bad state, right? So after she was gone, I started to notice it way more. Also, my job situation stabilized, right? By the time I had my breaking point in October of last year, I had been at my current job for about a year and a half. And my current job was going well. Thank God it's still going well. That's one thing I have a blessing on. So I was in a much more stable place, survival needs wise as well, right? So, because I wasn't having the constant turmoil of other things, the only turmoil I noticed was my marriage and just how deeply unhappy I was in the marriage, right? For a huge number of reasons. So, anyway, October of last year, I had it. I essentially reached a point to where I became ready to walk away from the marriage, ready to quit if I needed to, right? So what did I do? Did I instantly decide, oh my gosh, I'm unhappy, I'm going to go tell my wife I want a divorce? Of course not. That is definitely not what I did. Essentially, what happened was, I had already fallen out of love with my wife at this point, right? I still loved her deeply, but I wasn't in love with her. By October last year, that was gone. But I did still love her. I did still care for her deeply. All of these things, right? So when I went to my wife in October of last year and told her how deeply unhappy I was, my biggest hope at that time was to mend our broken marriage. I wanted it to be to a point to where I had those positive feelings about my wife again, where I wanted to be with her, where et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Those good feelings that you're supposed to have in a romantic relationship. Not feelings of isolation and loneliness like I had been having for a long time. So that's essentially what I wanted, right? So, what happened when I approached her? Well, I, essentially what I got was tons of argument, tons of resistance, right? Just a whole lot of, well, you did this and you did, and just back and forth, right? And there was a lot of that. Now, one thing I did do, and again, I did this with my ex-wife as well, ordered several books on the subject of marriage and, how to improve them. There's thousands of them out there. But I have to say that getting such books can be very valuable if your partner is actually willing to do the work with you regarding the books, right? So when we got these books in, what would happen is we would go through some of the book, and we probably did this a total of less than 10 times. When we would start to go through the book, we'd read it or whatever. And what was really funny is in these books, they would have sample, imaginary failing marriages, right? Where they would talk about whatever was going on in this marriage and why it was failing. And the first thing I noticed is these textbook example failing marriages were better than my marriage. The way they were describing them, they sounded better than my marriage. And I was like, holy shit. The fucking textbook failing marriages are better than my marriage. What does that say? Right? And what would happen is we would, read whatever point they were trying to make in the book. And a lot of times what would happen is my wife would yell at me about the things in the book that I wasn't doing. Instead of us having a real discussion about kind of how to mend things and come each other's way and make each other happier or whatever, she just started berating me about the stuff I wasn't doing. And that happened multiple times. So essentially, when we would, quote, do the work, she would try to punish me for it, right? There were also several times when she would do something nice for me, right? It would happen, okay? I would be very appreciative. And then the next day or the day of, she would punish me again. She would start a major argument with me, usually about our child. And of course, that didn't help. One of the incidents that really sticks out to me the most is, this was right around Thanksgiving of last year. This is an idea a friend of mine came up with, and I ran with it. He said, basically what the idea was is for us both to basically make a list of anything we want in the relationship. We can literally ask for anything. We could ask for $1 billion, move next to Disney, whatever. It doesn't matter. We were just supposed to write basically our wish lists for the relationship, right? Basically what each one of us wanted, right? Basically just write a list. I want this, 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 and this. And the idea was that would foster a discussion between the two of us to talk about it, see where each other were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I made my list in an hour or so, right? Because I knew exactly what I wanted out of the marriage. It wasn't a mystery to me. It was pretty obvious, right? And she didn't. In fact, I kept asking about it for about a week or so. And instead of doing a list, she spent all of her time playing video games, right? Again, I have no issue with that kind of thing in general. I mean, I play a lot of video games myself, but when your spouse is saying, hey, I'm unhappy in this marriage, can you do this thing for me? And just total lack of respect, not doing the work, is that is like a giant slap in the face, right? And then when she finally did make a list, it read like a ransom note penned by a kid or something. It was really bad. So, that just led to conflict, right? So, essentially, and then I'm not going to go over everything that happened, from October till May after I had my breaking point. But there were many incidents kind of like that, right? Where essentially I would try to get her to do something. She would maybe kind of do it, but then punish me for it afterwards, or she just wouldn't do it, and we'd have arguments about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And during those 7 months, right, the only thing that did was drive a wedge. I mean, our marriage was already bad, right? So during those 7 months, it was like putting nails in a coffin, right? At that point, it was like, it was dead, and we're just nailing the coffin shut at this point. And as far as my emotional state during those 7 months, it was all over the place. I remember in October, what my biggest fear was wasting years of my life on this. I was thinking to myself, what if she kind of half-ass does this stuff? And I think to myself, maybe this is worth staying together for, because she did this and she did that, and maybe this worked. Maybe, I was worried about her kind of doing it somewhat, but not really. And that was kind of my biggest fear, because I didn't want to, I didn't want to wait till I was 50 to make a decision on this, right? I wanted it to happen relatively quick. I didn't want to waste 5 to 10 years of my life on this, right? And, I was really, really worried about that. It was a very unfounded fear, I can tell you that much. And, I'll explain why here at the end. So that was kind of my initial feeling, right? I was really worried about that. I was like, oh my God, what if I waste so much time on this? And then, as it became obvious to me that she wasn't going to do what I wanted her to do, she wasn't going to be the person I needed her to be. How did that impact me? It impacted me a lot. It caused me a whole lot of emotional pain. Being rejected that way by your spouse that's supposed to love you is devastating. It's absolutely devastating. But after a while, you start to become somewhat used to it. Right? It's very interesting. It's just it's insane. But I was as far as my emotional state during those 7 months, probably some of the worst of my life. My stress level was so high it was actually giving me really high blood pressure. My blood pressure is not high, by the way. I went to a doctor very recently. They took my blood pressure, and it's completely normal. It's in the normal range. It's like, I don't know, I think my last number was like 115/75 or something. So yeah, but just knowing it went from that up to like dangerously high levels because of the stress I was under. That's not good, right? So it was some of the worst time period of my life. Not as bad as living with my mother was, but almost as bad. It was a close second to that as far as how much I was suffering during those several months, right? It was really bad because I went so depressed, so down in the dumps. And then when I reached the point of like me knowing that it wasn't going to turn around, that was another really bad moment, right? Because there's a big difference between I might have to divorce my wife to I know I have to divorce my wife if I want to have any chance of happiness whatsoever. I have to do it. I don't really have a choice. If I want any sort of happiness in my life, it's not going to be with my wife. I have to divorce her. And coming to that realization is so hard. Turning that corner is tough, but once you kind of get there, excuse me, it's easier to move forward than you would think because it allows you to actually have something in sight and to get through it, right? So, despite all of the pain and anger I went through, it was worth it in the end. Because during this time period, one thing, and because I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when I talk about kind of the current time period, and that is, there were so many times, like, I gave her, quote, another chance, right? Because I would call her out on this crap, her not doing what I asked her to do. Oh, just give me another chance. Okay. Give me it. And she would just basically never do whatever it was she was supposed to be doing, right? It just wouldn't happen. And then I will say the following. I'm not going to detail what this incident was, at least not currently. I might tell the story one day, but not today. There was an incident on Valentine's Day that was extremely disrespectful and hurtful. And I have to say, if it was not for my daughter, I would have thrown her out of my house that day. Just putting it out there. That's the level that this was at, right? And then the next day when I told her, clearly you're not interested in being married to me anymore, she cried and she begged me. She begged me for another chance. She's like, I'll do so much better this time, yada, yada, yada. It won't be this way. I'll do anything, etc., etc., etc. Well, clearly that didn't go so well, right? So, even after she begged me that way, she honestly acted like she couldn't much give a damn about how, if our marriage survived or not, right? Her words did not remotely match her actions at all for those 7 months, right? It was just total crap, total fight, total whatever, and eventually I got the message, right? Which I will talk about in the next part of this. So to wrap up, basically, it was an extremely hard time, but it was a transition period that was worth it, right? Essentially. So, anyway, that's it for this part. I'm going to break it up, the third part where I'm going to talk about the current era, which is going to be next. So, as always, live long and prosper, keep on rocking. I'll see you guys soon.